Hello, it's Arran here at the Battle of Preston Pans Museum in East Lothian, Scotland, with the latest update of our What If interactive wargame campaign. As usual, Facebook votes have determined what happens with the Jacobite armies, whilst a close group of Redcoat reenactors have been determining the British Army's responses. I know it's not that long since our last update, but there's been some pretty important developments that I thought it was important to share with you. Now, in our last update, we had a strategic situation looking a little bit like this. Fort George had been taken by the Jacobites, but William and Augustus, both still held by tiny British garrisons, and Stirling Castle, like Edinburgh before it, has fallen to the main Jacobite field army. That small Jacobite flag down in the Scottish borders shows where Lord George Murray's triumphant division is after the engagement at Sutra Hill, which had destroyed General Cope and his cavalry brigade covering Wade's flank, that big British flag representing Wade's army as it marched into Scotland. The large-scale skirmish at Sutra Hill had all but destroyed the cavalry wing of Marshal Wade's army, leaving him pretty unprotected as he advanced into Scotland up the east coast, as a result of which he decided he was going to stop in Dunbar and hold his position, awaiting further instructions. General Cope, incidentally, having commanded at this skirmish, he managed to get back to Dunbar with just 2 small regiments of cavalry remaining. Now, the Jacobites were buoyed by their victory over Wade's cavalry, by their successes at Stirling and elsewhere, and of course by the reinforcements that finally arrived under Lord John Drummond, including some French regulars and additional guns. But still, the Jacobite vote over what to do next was initially torn, with even votes for marching directly on Marshal Wade at Dunbar and for taking the army into England. But since those who were voting for marching into England couldn't decide between them whether to go to Carlisle or Newcastle, eventually it was decided that the army should march directly on Marshal Wade, even though he was likely to be entrenched and it would be difficult to dislodge him. Meanwhile, at Dunbar, Marshal Wade was unhappy. Not only had he lost his cavalry, but he also lost a full brigade, the Dutch regiments having to return after hearing of the landing of the French troops under John Drummond, due to a previous parole arrangement. That meant that he was now at a numerical disadvantage against the Jacobites should they march against him. Remember, Marshal Wade had the only army north of London. Duke of Cumberland was far too far away to make any influence on this part of the campaign. So a vote was held amongst the British Army's Council, and they decided that they were going to hold their position and hope that the Jacobites would risk coming against a prepared position at Dunbar. So the stage was set on the 18th of November for the first big battle of our campaign, and it turned out to be a grueling 5 hours over the tabletops in the museum here, as the outcome was fought hard. This would be the 3rd battle, had it happened historically, to have taken place at Dunbar. Both of the previous attempts, 1296 and 1615, had been disastrous Scottish defeats. Would the Jacobites be able to fare any better than their historical antecedents? So, looking at Roy's military survey of the area around Dunbar in the mid-18th century, we see we've got quite a complex and difficult battlefield for the Jacobite army to fight in. It's a coastal battlefield on the North Sea. There is the town of Dunbar itself, and over on the western side of the battlefield, the smaller village of Belhaven. Between the two is an expanse with cliffs on its north side, connected by a road, and there's this important piece of high ground here, Knockenhare, where the windmill dominates the surrounding fields. The Bealburn runs along one side of the battlefield, whilst the Broxburn runs along the opposite side of the battlefield, the big estate there, Broxmouth House. In the centre of our battlefield, we have a very significant location, this big square estate, Loch End, with stone walls and enclosures. This is sure to be a grinding point during the battle. I'll also draw your attention to the high ground on which stands Dunbar Parish Church. So we've got a complicated battlefield and a difficult challenge to represent this landscape on a tabletop. But we like a challenge here at the museum, so we've done our best to transfer this landscape onto the tabletop. Now, this photograph has just cropped out the extreme ends of our gaming table, but on one end there was the village of Belhaven, connected by road through Wade's camp at Winterfield to the town of Dunbar itself, and then at the extreme end, Broxmouth Estate, controlling the road over the ford at Broxmouth towards England. There's the parish church on its high ground, there's Knockenhare on its high ground, and in the centre, in its stone-walled enclosure, Lochend House. So this is the landscape in which the Third Battle of Dunbar would have been fought had our campaign been occurring in 1745. Going over to the extreme eastern end of the battlefield, this is the ford at Broxmouth with Brand's Mill. This is the road to England, which Marshal Wade might want to keep open if he has a hope of escaping from the landscape. Broxmouth House and the parish church, both walled enclosures which are able to control this road. When Wade is planning his defences, he can look to places like this, where the church itself can be occupied and the high ground surrounded by stone walls as well, and then beyond the town itself, if Wade needs to, a last stand could be made in amongst those buildings, making life very difficult for the Jacobites, but perhaps trapping Wade and limiting his options too. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Marshal Wade's decided not to centre his defences on the town, or indeed on the road into England, but rather to face the Jacobites before they get near those eastern locations. Instead, the defence is based around Lochend Estate, right in the centre of the battlefield. As you can see, there's 2 battalions of foot centred in the estate grounds itself, in the middle. There's another set entrenched on the western side and on the eastern side as well, all with supporting reserves. Cope's right flank is in front of the high ground at Knockenhare, where he has Fleming's regiment behind Cheval de Frise out in the open, protecting the approaches to Knockenhare, and covering Fleming's from the high ground at Knockenhare, the batteries of British Army guns. And on Marshal Wade's extreme right, General Cope and the survivors of the cavalry battle at Sutra Hill, part of the 13th Dragoons and the survivors of the Northumberland Mounted Militia. So General Cope has decided that he's going to keep the road to England open on his left, and he's basing his defence on Lochend. He's got his regiments lined up in supporting positions, a killing zone in the centre around Lochend, Pulteney's supported to his centre right, and then Fleming's, the batteries, and General Cope's cavalry protecting his extreme flank. Now, historically, in 1745, the day before this battle would have taken place, there was a terrible storm, wrecking HMS Fox just off Dunbar and damaging other vessels in the Firth of Forth. So it was determined that these historical weather conditions must have delayed the Jacobite army's march out of Haddington, and we've represented that by the fact that the Jacobite army cannot deploy all of its forces at the start of the battle. So Charles Edward moves on with his first 2 divisions, led by Lord George Murray and the Duke of Perth. Charles Edward deploys Murray's division on his left, looking at Fleming's and Knockenhare, and then he deploys Perth's division on his right, facing off towards Lochend. Unfortunately, the rolls go against the Prince, however, and other divisions fail to come on as he's moving into position ready to attack. The Prince nonetheless decides to make his move. He's got some of his best men on the field, the Highland regiments that had won the Battle of Prestonpans for him, but he in fact decides to begin the battle with a cannonade, opening fire with his left-hand battery onto the heights at Knockenhare, targeting Fleming's regiment and the guns behind them. The Jacobite batteries are in fact very effective in their fire on the exposed Flemings, even though they're under fire from the British Army's batteries, which are less effective at targeting the Jacobites. So the cannonade opens the Third Battle of Dunbar. The Jacobite left pushes forward, manages to drive off the remnants of the Northumbrian Mounted Militia, but are held in check for some time by Gardiner's Dragoons, the survivors of both Prestonpans and Sutra Hill, led by Sir John Cope, who's determined to redeem his reputation. Charles Edward's centre is initially stalled because it's unable to approach the redcoat lines because of the killing zone created by those defending the Loch End walled enclosure. So he throws massive attacks into that enclosure, hoping to be able to clear them with the Highland charge. It's ineffective, however. Jacobite casualties mount up pretty high in the Duke of Perth's division. In fact, fairly early in the engagement, several key regiments are driven from the battlefield. The Cameron of Lochiel's regiment is broken, a devastating blow to the centre of the Jacobite line. The effectiveness of the British volleys is devastating to the Jacobites as they try to close in on these entrenched redcoats. Hoping to alleviate some of the pressure on the centre, Charles Edward orders one of his guns up onto the right, but the British army extends its flank, pulling out one of its reserve regiments, and are able to pour devastating volleys into Kilmarnock's foot guards and the Jacobite artillery. In fact, the Jacobite gunners are barely able to withstand the first volley before they rout and leave their piece behind. The brutal grind in the centre continues, but eventually the Duke of Perth's regiment is able to break through at Loch End Estate, driving off the British regiment that's holding it, but Jacobite casualties have been severe, and the Prince is now riding up and down the lines, rallying his men as much as he possibly can, desperately hoping for reinforcements to arrive soon. Only once the British troops holding Loch End are under severe pressure is the Prince able to release some of the clansmen in his centre, the Stuarts of Appin charging into Flemings who have already been badly battered by the Jacobite artillery. And as the Duke of Perth's regiment continues to clear Loch End Estate, they're able to throw more support against the regiments holding the centre, which begins to consider starting to withdraw around the northern side of the battlefield. But the success of the clansmen in the Jacobite centre proves short-lived, and although the Duke of Perth's regiment is able to clear out Loch End Estate, it comes under fire from the reserve battalions beyond on the northern side, and the estate is cleared of Jacobites in turn. The central ground of the battlefield, centred on Loch End, becomes a no-man's land between the two armies, both having suffered heavy casualties in attacking and defending it. Fortunately for Charles Edward, however, this is the moment that Lord Lewis Gordon finally arrives with reinforcement division. The lowland forces that he brings are able to start putting fire in the Jacobite centre, and he even brings up the first of the French regulars that had landed at Leith just a few days before. The sudden arrival of new troops on the Jacobite left opens up new opportunities at the weakest point of the British line. The Prince is able to consolidate, and he starts moving the unit of Strathallan's horse round the Beal Burn towards Belhaven so that he might be able to at last drive off the cavalry there, led by Sir John Cope. If he can turn the British army's flank here, he might well be able to roll up the whole of the British line, rampaging through their camp as they do. And what follows is one of the most heroic actions of the battle so far, when Gardiner's, now Ligonier's dragoons, hold off the advance of Strathallan's horse near Belhaven. And despite the Jacobites having the support of clansmen to the rear, it takes them a long time to break through that bitter cavalry engagement. Sir John Cope, his reputation redeemed, falls amongst the men here, and the Jacobites are finally able to get their hands on the famous Britons Strike Home guidon that they'd failed to take both at Prestonpans and at Sutra Hill just a few days before. Once they're successful on their extreme left, the Jacobite horsemen are able to sweep up the slope at Knockenhare and take out the British batteries that had been for so long threatening the centre and left of the Jacobite line. Marshal Wade, seeing the danger, is able to withdraw his reserve battalions closer towards Dunbar and begin condensing his line and rationalising his lines of defence. The cavalry action at Belhaven has bought him enough time to disengage successfully. Then another Jacobite brigade arrives on the field, this time led by Brigadier Stapleton, and Stapleton is able to bring forward the Royal Écossois, French regulars who can put impressive supporting fire in against the clansmen who are still under intense pressure at this part of the Jacobite line. The Earl of Kilmarnock's foot guards put up a stubborn fight, charging into the teeth of the British volley fire and suffering heavy casualties they do. But the arrival of French regulars does ease the pressure on the clansmen, and the Jacobites are putting in some fire that makes the British position seem suddenly much more vulnerable than it has so far in the battle. So it seems the battle reaches a tipping point, a very dangerous moment for Marshal Wade as his lines begin to contract. In fact, Lord Elcho leads a charge onto the flank of the British Army's position just as the Kilmarnock foot guards are going in. But at the same time, Marshal Wade is pulling his reserves back from his right, away from Loch End, and these are able to come into a new position and in turn threaten the flank of the charging horsemen. The scene on the eastern side of the battle becomes a tangled and confused mess. Jacobite divisions are completely intermixed. Units are being thrown in charge and counter-charge, flanking charge and rearward charge, and units being brought over from the British right, hoping to find safety on the road towards England, are thrown into the battle to keep that road open. It's intense, it's swinging both ways, and both sides are suffering heavy casualties. Finally, late in the day, the last Jacobite units arrive on the field, a cavalry brigade led by the Earl of Kilmarnock. In an attempt to make the victory as total as possible, and therefore worth the terrible losses that have been sustained so far, the Jacobites attempt to close the road to England, just as they see Marshal Wade starting to shift his weight towards the extreme east. The result, though, is that the Jacobite cavalry, fresh though they are obliged to charge towards the waiting volleys of British infantry. Disordered as they go in, the cavalry are stopped and suffer terrible casualties from the withering volleys. At last, the Lowlanders are able to push the remaining British battalions away from Loch End and drive them back towards the parish church at Dunbar. Batterroy's regiment is holding on here, but its flank is threatened by the advancing Jacobite units who've swept around Loch End through the British camp due to their success over on the extreme end of the battlefield. Batterroys seem virtually cut off as the rest of the British battalions that have survived the battle are shifting towards Broxmouth. Wade is now down to less than half of his original strength, and those battalions are battered and bruised. Nevertheless, they hold a strong position on the road out of Dunbar towards the border. They've successfully driven off the Jacobite cavalry, although they're unable to support Batterroys who've become isolated near the parish church. At this point, with day turning towards night, Marshal Wade assesses that his men have done all that can be asked of them. There's no way they can win the battle now that so many Jacobite units are on the field, even though those Jacobite units have been badly bloodied. So he does what is necessary. He withdraws under cover of darkness all those battalions which are able to reach the road towards the border. These men will be able to get down to Newcastle in safety. Wade's withdrawal is covered by Batterroy's regiment, who are holed up in the churchyard and the high ground on which the parish church of Dunbar stands. The Jacobites have lost so much of their cavalry that a pursuit of Wade's units is unlikely, and so they're content as the evening wears on to surround the position of the churchyard and negotiate a surrender. Charles Edward Stuart has won another battlefield victory, but at quite some cost, throwing clansmen against entrenched prepared positions into the teeth of disciplined volleys. So let's have a look at our campaign map now that the Third Battle of Dunbar has been fought, lost and won. Marshal Wade is withdrawing with the surviving battalions of his army towards Newcastle. He's got a good head start on the Jacobites because Charles Edward has suffered sufficient losses to have to remain in Dunbar for several days whilst he consolidates some of his regiments. Those that have been reduced in size by the losses they've sustained will be replaced by garrison units from Stirling and Edinburgh, good regiments that can be brought across within a matter of days. So the Jacobites can choose to either march on Newcastle, following Wade down the east coast, and they can besiege that city and snuff out what remains of Wade's threat. But that's a siege they'll have to now fight against regular battalions. Alternatively, there's a much smaller garrison over at Carlisle, and they could strike that way. Crossing into England will surely finally be enough to enable the Jacobite supporters there to start rallying in support, and it might even be enough to persuade the French that they should stop sending small supply reinforcements and now send a major army to intervene in the conflict. Meanwhile, however, at London, the Duke of Cumberland has brought his army together and is marching out of the city. He could strike towards either direction as the Jacobites move, but he is still a long way away, and there's ample time, it seems, if the Jacobites move quickly, for them to take either Newcastle or Carlisle before Cumberland can intercept them. What the Jacobites choose to do, however, will be down to the vote. So it seems the campaign is still all to play for. It could still go either direction. We've seen that the Jacobites struggle in a frontal assault on a prepared enemy position, but at some point they're going to have to take the war into England if they want to bring the French fully on board. Let's wait and see what happens. Thanks for watching.